8-year-old Tiffany Crawford sat on the floor of her room on Maple Street in Lakewood, going through toys. The girl with the neat pigtails and serious dark eyes picked up a yellow baby walkie-talkie, a gift from her grandfather for her last birthday. This toy was one of her favorites. Tiffany often imagined herself as a spaceship commander or secret agent, giving important orders through a microphone and imagining exciting adventures in distant galaxies. She turned on the radio and heard the familiar static hiss. Tiffany usually twisted the tuning knobs, catching scraps of distant radio stations or just enjoying the sounds of static that in her imagination turned into messages from outer space. The antenna extended with a familiar click, and the girl began to scroll through the frequencies. She loved this process of searching, never knowing what she might hear next. The plastic body of the radio, worn from frequent use, lay comfortably in her small hands. Her grandfather had taught her how to handle the device properly, explaining how the volume and tuning knobs worked, how to extend the antenna for better reception. Tiffany was proud that she could handle the radio better than many of her classmates who preferred simpler toys. A clear female voice came through the crackle. Tiffany was surprised at the quality of the sound and listened more closely. The woman spoke in the professional tone of a radio host, talking about local events in Lakewood. She mentioned an upcoming festival in Central Park, recommended a new library exhibit on the city's history, and shared tips for parents on how to organize their children's weekend activities. Her voice was pleasant, with a slight hint of the southern accent often heard in their neighborhood. The woman spoke measuredly, enunciating each word clearly, and Tiffany imagined a smiling host in the studio of a local radio station. The girl had never heard this program before, although she had been playing regularly with the radio for months. The program lasted about 15 minutes, after which the interference began again. Tiffany twisted the knob, trying to catch the signal, but the woman's voice disappeared into the static. She continued to play with the radio for another half hour, switching between frequencies, but she heard nothing else of interest, just the usual static and occasional distant scraps of music from commercial radio stations. The next day after school, the girl took up the radio again. She settled down on her bed with pillows under her back and turned on the device. This time, she had better luck. The same female voice came on almost as soon as she found the right frequency. The transmission was different, more intimate in tone. The woman was discussing family relationships, talking about the importance of open communication between spouses and sharing listeners' stories of overcoming family crises. She talked about couples who were able to mend their relationships after serious conflicts, how important it is not to shut down and seek help from loved ones or professionals. Tiffany didn't really understand the intricacies of adult relationships that the presenter was talking about, but her voice seemed soothing and kind. The woman talked about how important it was to find compromises in marriage, how to deal with disagreements, and not let small quarrels grow into serious conflicts. The girl listened, imagining that this was a special program for adults, which she happened to catch on her children's radio. Over the next few days, such broadcasts became a regular occurrence. Every day when Tiffany came home from school and did her homework, she turned on the radio and could almost always hear the same woman's voice. Sometimes it was advice on housekeeping, recipes for simple dishes for busy families. Sometimes it was about raising children and teenagers, and sometimes it was just a reflection on everyday life in a small town. The girl got used to these programs and even began to look forward to them. She did her homework under the quiet background of a woman's voice, which created an atmosphere of coziness and calmness in the room. Sometimes Tiffany even took her mind off math or reading to listen to particularly interesting tips or stories. The woman often talked about the importance of family traditions and how to create an atmosphere of understanding and support at home. She told about simple ways to show loved ones her love, how to choose gifts and organize family holidays. Tiffany memorized some of the ideas, thinking about what she could suggest to her mother for their own family nights. One evening, as Tiffany was playing in her room with a new board game, the walkie-talkie came to life again. A woman's voice sounded as usual, but this time, the topic was completely different. The host wasn't speaking for the radio listeners, but as if she was talking to herself or jotting down some personal notes. The tone became more intimate, almost a whisper. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing by hiding my fears from him," she said, thoughtfully and sadly. "Maybe I should have talked openly, but after the incident with the broken vase, I'm afraid to bring it up again." Tiffany set aside her dice and listened intently. It didn't sound like a normal radio program. The woman spoke more softly, more personally, as if she were confiding her deepest secrets to the microphone. There was a tiredness in her voice, and some underlying sadness. "Yesterday he raised his voice again because dinner wasn't ready on time," the woman continued, her words painful. "I know he's tired from work, but these angry outbursts are starting to scare me, especially when he starts waving his arms around and yelling that I don't understand him and don't appreciate his efforts." The girl felt a little uneasy. She didn't understand all the nuances of adult relationships, but the woman's intonation was clearly sad and anxious. Tiffany continued to listen, holding the walkie-talkie to her ear and forgetting her game. "Sometimes I think about talking to someone about it." The woman's voice shook with held-back emotion. "Maybe with her sister or her friend Linda. But how to explain that the husband, who seems so charming and successful to everyone we know, turns into a completely different person at home?" The woman was silent for a few seconds, and Tiffany heard a quiet sigh. "He apologizes later, of course. He says he didn't mean to scare me, that he was just nervous. He brings me flowers or suggests we go out to a restaurant. But I see something in his eyes. Cold. Like he's thinking about something I shouldn't even know about." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving Tiffany deeply confused. She turned off the radio and put it aside, feeling that she had heard something very personal and important. The girl couldn't understand why the radio host started telling such sad stories about her family, but she intuitively felt that it was something serious. Tiffany went downstairs, where her mother Rachel was cooking dinner. The smell of fried chicken filled the kitchen, and rice was bubbling quietly on the stove. Rachel stood at the sink, washing vegetables for a salad, humming some tune she'd heard on the radio on her way to work that morning. "Mom," Tiffany called out, taking a seat on a chair near the kitchen table. "My radio is picking up some strange broadcasts." Rachel Crawford, a 34-year-old woman with short hair and tired but kind eyes, turned from the stove. She looked exhausted after a long day at the law firm where she worked as a paralegal, but she always took the time and energy to listen to her daughter. Family was the most important thing in her life. "What's with the transmissions, baby girl?" she asked, wiping her hands with a kitchen towel and sitting down across from her daughter. "There's a woman talking about family stuff," Tiffany explained, trying to find the right words. "First it was the usual advice about cooking and kids, and now she's telling some sad stories about her husband. She says he yells at her and scares her." Rachel listened attentively, but an understanding smile appeared on her face. "It happens, darling," she said softly. "Your radio can pick up signals from different stations, even ones that are quite far away from here. Maybe you're on some adult program where people talk about their problems, or a local radio station that discusses family matters." Tiffany nodded, but the feeling of unease didn't leave her completely. The next evening she turned on the radio again, hoping to hear the usual advice about cooking or parenting. A woman's voice came on almost immediately, but this time there was real anxiety, even fear in its intonation. "He told me that if I brought it up again, I'd regret it," the woman said quietly, as if she was afraid someone might hear her. "I don't know exactly what he meant, but his gaze was so cold and hard. I'd never seen him like that before, not even in the most difficult moments of our marriage." My voice shook with barely contained emotion. Maybe I was exaggerating, but I thought there was a threat in his words, not direct, but understandable. He has a way of saying things so that he's not technically saying anything wrong, but I felt my insides turn upside down with fear. Tiffany felt she had to tell her mom right away. She ran to Rachel's house, holding the walkie-talkie in her hands. Her mother was sitting in the living room, reviewing the work papers for tomorrow and making notes in her notebook. "Mom, listen." Tiffany held out the walkie-talkie to her mother. "This woman is saying very strange and sad things again." Rochelle put the papers aside and picked up the device. The woman's voice kept talking, and Rochelle immediately realized that this was no ordinary radio program. "I'm thinking of recording our conversation so I don't forget important details," the woman said in a tired voice. "Maybe someday I'll need those recordings as proof of what really happened in our house." The expression on Rachel's face gradually changed. She was listening intently to the voice, as if trying to determine who it belonged to. Something in the intonation, in the way she spoke, seemed painfully familiar. "Mom, do you recognize that voice?" Tiffany asked quietly. Rachel was silent for several long seconds, listening intently to every word. The voice was indeed very familiar. She had heard that voice many times over the past 3 years when she met her neighbor at the local store or at the mailboxes. "Jeanette," Rachel whispered, feeling her heartbeat quicken. "That's the voice of Jeanette Reeves, our neighbor." Tiffany looked at her mother with wide-open eyes. "But didn't Aunt Jeanette go somewhere a few months ago? You said you hadn't seen her for a long time." Rachel nodded slowly. Indeed, Jeanette Reeves had disappeared from the neighbor's sight about 3 months ago. Rochelle remembered Janet's husband, Dustin, telling the neighbors that his wife had gone to visit relatives and had no plans to return yet. If this was really Jeanette, and she was talking about problems at home, why was her husband telling them that she had left? Rachel felt a chill in her chest. The voice on the walkie-talkie continued, "I'll try to talk to him again tomorrow. Maybe if I'm careful with my choice of words, he won't get so angry. But it's scary to even think about what will happen if he finds out about those tapes." Rachel turned off the walkie-talkie and looked at her daughter with serious eyes. "Tiffany, this is very important. I'm going to call the police tomorrow morning. If it really is our neighbor and she's in trouble, she needs help." "But maybe it's just some kind of radio play?" the girl asked uncertainly. "Maybe," agreed Rachel. "But it's better to check and be wrong than to remain silent if someone is really in danger." The next morning, after taking Tiffany to school, Rachel dialed the number of the local police station. The officer on duty put her through to Detective Kira Patton, who investigated missing persons and domestic violence. Detective Patton, a confident female voice answered. "Hello, my name is Rachel Crawford. I'd like to report a strange situation with our neighbor," Rachel began, feeling uncomfortable that she couldn't accurately explain the problem. "I'm listening to you," the detective said patiently. "My daughter hears a woman's voice through the baby radio talking about problems with her husband. I recognize the voice of our neighbor Jeanette Reeves, who disappeared 3 months ago. Her husband said she had gone to visit relatives, but what we hear sounds like a cry for help." Detective Patton recorded the information, asking clarifying questions about the time of Jeanette's disappearance, what exactly Rochelle and her daughter heard, and asking for a description of the neighbor's husband's behavior in recent months. "I'll come to your house tonight," the detective said at the end of the conversation. "I'll need to listen to the broadcasts myself and talk to your daughter," Rachel agreed, realizing she had made the right move. If Jeanette really needed help, time could be critical. Detective Kira Patton arrived at the Crawford home at 7 p.m. sharp, as promised. A 40-year-old African-American woman with short graying hair and shrewd brown eyes, she'd been with the Lakewood Police Department for 15 years and had seen enough family tragedies to take any signals of possible domestic violence seriously. Rachel met her at the front door and escorted her into the living room, where Tiffany sat on the couch with a yellow walkie-talkie in her hands. The girl looked worried, but ready to help the adults make sense of the strange situation. "Tiffany, tell the detective what you're hearing through your walkie-talkie," Rochelle asked softly, taking a seat next to her daughter. "At first I heard the usual cooking and baby stuff," the girl began, addressing Detective Patton. "Then a woman started telling sad stories about her husband yelling at her and how afraid she was of him." The detective nodded and pulled a small notebook out of her bag. "Can you turn on the radio now? I need to listen to these broadcasts myself." Tiffany twiddled the tuning knobs, and after a few seconds, A familiar female voice came from the speaker. The recording was different this time, but the tone was still the same anxious and tired one. "I plan to go to the doctor this morning for a routine checkup," the woman said. "Then I need to pick up my dress from the dry cleaners and buy groceries for dinner. He likes fish Fridays, and I don't want to upset him over little things like that." Detective Patton listened intently, jotting down key details in her notebook. The voice did sound like personal notes or diary entries rather than a radio program. "Last night he asked where I'd put his favorite mug. I explained it was in the dishwasher, but he got mad anyway, said I was hiding his stuff on purpose to spite him. Then he went into the garage and didn't talk to me until the morning." Patton raised her eyebrows at the mention of specific domestic details. It certainly didn't sound like a fictional radio show or a psychological counseling program. "Mrs. Crawford, are you really sure you recognize that voice?" the detective asked as she continued to listen to the tape. "I'm absolutely sure," Rachel replied firmly. "It's Jeanette Reeves, our neighbor. She lives in the house with the blue shutters across the street, or lived there before she disappeared." "Tell me more about this disappearance. When was the last time you saw Mrs. Reeves?" Rochelle thought for a moment, remembering the details. It was late September. "I met her at the mailbox, and we talked about the weather and the fact that schools would soon be closing for fall break. She looked tired, but I figured she was just working hard. Janet hosts a program on a local radio station about family relationships." The detective recorded this information, noting the missing woman's occupation. "And when did you learn of her alleged departure?" "About a week after we met. I noticed the lights in their house were off in the evenings and asked Dustin, her husband, about it when I saw him in the yard. He said that Jeanette had gone to visit her ailing mother in Atlanta and didn't know yet when she would be back." The voice on the walkie-talkie continued. "Tomorrow is our wedding anniversary. I'm thinking of making something special. Maybe that cake he loved at the beginning of our marriage. I'd like to believe that a romantic evening will help us regain our intimacy." The detective frowned. If the woman was planning a wedding anniversary, it didn't fit in any way with the theory of a trip to visit her ailing mother. "Mrs. Crawford, did Mr. Reeves ever explain why his wife didn't say goodbye to the neighbors before she left? Didn't pick up the mail or warn them of a long absence?" "Now that you ask it, it does seem odd," Rochelle said slowly. "Jeanette was always very polite and considerate to the neighbors. She usually gave notice if she planned to be gone even for a weekend." Patton decided it was time to look into the case in more detail. The next day, she went to the police station archives to see if Dustin Reeves had filed a missing wife report. To her surprise, no official paperwork turned up. That was the first major disturbing detail. If the wife had indeed gone to visit a sick relative and lost contact, any normal husband would have contacted the police in a matter of days or weeks. The detective decided to pay Dustin Reeves a personal visit. She pulled up to the house with the blue shutters at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when most people are at work. Dustin was supposed to be working as a technician at the local radio station, but his car was parked in the driveway. The man who opened the door looked about his 45 years, but seemed noticeably thinner and nervous. He had dark circles under his eyes and an unshaven face. Dustin wore an old t-shirt and work jeans, as if he wasn't going out. "Mr. Reeves, I'm Detective Patton with the Lakewood Police Department. Can I talk to you about your wife?" Dustin visibly tensed but tried to feign surprise. "About Jeanette? Is something wrong?" He sounded worried. "May I come in? I'd like to ask a few questions about her departure." Dustin hesitated for a few seconds, then reluctantly stepped back, allowing the detective into the house. Patton immediately noticed that the living room was unusually clean, as if someone had recently given it a thorough cleaning. The smell of chlorinated cleaning products still hung in the air. "Mr. Reeves, your neighbors are worried about Mrs. Reeves. Tell me more about her trip to Atlanta." Dustin sat down in the chair across from the couch where the detective had settled and ran his hand over his face several times. Jeanette had gone to visit her mother in late September. Her mom had been diagnosed with heart problems, and Jeanette decided she needed to be there for her. We had an argument before she left. and she said she didn't know when she'd be back. What was the argument about? The usual family problems. Dustin looked away. She thought I didn't spend enough time at home, and I thought she didn't appreciate how hard I worked for our family. The detective wrote down his words, noting the contradictions. Mr. Reeves, why didn't you file a missing persons report if your wife hasn't contacted you in 3 months? Dustin turned visibly pale. She'd called a few times. Not very often, though. Said she was focused on her mom and wasn't ready to settle yet. Can you give me the phone number of your wife's mother? I need to make sure Mrs. Reeves is safe. I don't have that number, Dustin quickly replied. Jeanette's been calling from different phones, saying her mother's having trouble with her home phone. Patton raised an eyebrow. This story was becoming less and less believable. What's your wife's mother's name? And her full address in Atlanta? Dustin hesitated, obviously not expecting such detailed questions. Dorothy Johnson. But I don't remember the exact address, somewhere on the north side of town. The detective noticed that the man was avoiding direct eye contact, and his hands were shaking slightly. These were all classic signs of deception. Mr. Reeves, your wife worked in radio. Did she have any home recording equipment? No, Dustin answered too quickly. I mean, there was some old equipment, but she didn't use it. All the work was done in the studio. Can we take a look around the house, especially the place where the wife might have been recording? Do you have a warrant? Dustin rose from his chair, and his voice became sharper. Not yet, but I can get one if I have reason to suspect a crime. The man had calmed down a little, but he still looked tense. I don't understand what crime we're talking about. My wife just went to visit her sick mother. The detective decided to change tactics. Mr. Reeves, do you have any close friends or co-workers who may have had contact with your wife before she left? You can talk to Leon Brooks. We worked together at the radio station. He knew Jeanette pretty well. Patton wrote down the name, realizing that talking to a colleague might provide additional information about the Reeves family situation. The next day, the detective went to the radio station where Dustin and Leon worked. The small building was located in the business section of Lakewood, and Leon Brooks appeared to be a friendly man in his mid-50s, with a graying beard and attentive eyes. Detective Patton, Dustin tells me you're interested in Jeanette's disappearance, Leon said, inviting her into the small break room. Frankly, I've been wanting to talk to someone about it myself for a long time. What's bothering you, Mr. Brooks? Leon looked around, making sure no one could hear them. Dustin had changed a lot since his wife's disappearance. He'd always been a rather withdrawn man, but he'd been acting very strangely for the last few months. Nervous when anyone mentions Jeanette, and a few times I've seen him erase something off his computer when I've walked into his office. Tell me about their relationship. Did they seem to you to be happily married? Jeanette was a wonderful woman, Leon said carefully. But in the last year before she disappeared, she became more withdrawn. Sometimes she'd come to work with bruises on her arms, saying she'd fallen or hit herself at home. And Dustin. He's become more aggressive, especially when he drinks. The detective wrote down every detail carefully. Mr. Brooks, did you ever notice Mrs. Reeves recording anything at home? Trial versions of her programs, perhaps? Sure, Leon nodded. She had old but good equipment at home. She often rehearsed programs, recorded interviews in advance. Jeanette was very professional and thoroughly prepared for each broadcast. This directly contradicted Dustin's statement that his wife didn't use the home equipment. And after she disappeared, did Dustin say anything about that equipment? He said he threw away all her work materials because they reminded him of Jeanette. Leon frowned. But I thought it was odd to get rid of expensive equipment. The detective thanked Leon for the information and returned to the station with growing suspicions about Dustin Reeves. The contradictions in his story, the lack of a missing persons report, the lies about the equipment, and a co-worker's testimony of possible domestic violence were adding up to a disturbing picture. The next day, Detective Patton contacted the police technical department to arrange a trace of the radio signal Tiffany's baby radio had been picking up. A radio specialist, a young fellow named Markel Williams, arrived at the Crawford home with portable equipment to determine the source of the transmission. "It's a pretty simple task," he explained to the detective as he set up a directional antenna on a tripod in the yard. "Children's radios operate on low frequencies, and if the signal is strong enough to be picked up regularly, the source must be nearby." Tiffany watched the technician work with interest, holding her yellow walkie-talkie and waiting for the next transmission. Rachel stood nearby, occasionally glancing toward the Reeves house across the street, where lights were on in the windows, though it wasn't yet dark outside. After about 20 minutes, a familiar female voice came from the walkie-talkie. Markel quickly began turning the antenna in different directions, watching the readings on his equipment. "The signal is coming from that direction," he said, pointing directly at the house with the blue shutters. "The source is within 100 meters, most likely in that building." Detective Patton felt her pulse quicken. The technical confirmation made the situation much more serious. "Janet in this recording talks about grocery shopping and plans for tomorrow," Rachel whispered, listening to the transmission. "But her husband claims she left 3 months ago." The voice on the walkie-talkie was especially clear today. "Tomorrow is Friday, and I want to cook his favorite fish. Maybe if the dinner is especially good, he won't be mad about that bill that came yesterday. I forgot to tell him about the extra charge for cable." Markel was writing down the exact coordinates of the signal source, and Detective Patton was already mentally mapping out a plan to get a search warrant. The technical evidence, combined with the contradictions in Dustin's testimony, provided sufficient grounds for a formal investigation. "Mrs. Crawford, thank you so much for your civility," the detective said, putting away her notebook. "Tomorrow morning, I'll get a warrant and search the Reeves' home." Rachel nodded, but looked concerned. "Detective, what if we're wrong? What if this is really some kind of radio play or old tapes?" "Then we'll just apologize to Mr. Reeves for the inconvenience," Patton replied. "But if Jeanette really needs help, every day could be critical." The next morning, the detective obtained a search warrant for the Reeves home. The judge agreed that the contradictions in Dustin's testimony, the lack of a missing persons report, and technical confirmation of the radio source created sufficient grounds for suspicion of a crime. Patton arrived at the blue-shuttered house accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a technician. Dustin opened the door, looking even more haggard than when they first met. He clearly wasn't expecting an official visit. "Mr. Reeves, we have a warrant to search your home," the detective said, holding out the paperwork to him. "We're looking for evidence of what happened to your wife." Dustin took the warrant with trembling hands and ran his eyes over the text. His face turned dead pale. "I don't see why this is necessary. Jeanette has simply gone to her mother's." "Then you won't mind looking around the house," Patton replied calmly. The officers began a methodical search, starting on the first floor. The detective concentrated on finding the home recording equipment Leon Brooks had mentioned. Nothing suspicious was found in the living room or kitchen, but in the basement they found what they were looking for. In a corner of the basement room was a professional recording rig with a microphone, mixing console, and several monitors. The equipment was quite old, but clearly functional. On a shelf next to it were stacks of CDs, labeled in a woman's handwriting. "Mr. Reeves," the detective called out, "can you explain what this equipment is?" Dustin came down into the basement, and his expression became even more tense. "This is Jeanette's old equipment. She used to rehearse her shows here sometimes, but she hasn't used it in a while." The technician examined the rig more closely. "Detective, this equipment was recently used. The indicators show that the system had been active in the last few days. There was a small red light on the control panel indicating that the unit was in standby mode. Several cables were connected to a transmitting antenna that stretched to the top of the house. It seems that the recordings are automatically transmitted on a certain frequency," the specialist continued. "Perhaps because of a malfunction in the system, the old recordings began to play back cyclically." The detective asked to play some discs from the shelf. The first disc contained Janet's usual radio programs about family relationships, parenting tips, and recipes. But the second disc contained recordings of a completely different nature. Jeanette's voice sounded tired and frightened. Today, he hit me for the first time. Not hard, more like a push, but I saw something frightening in his eyes. He said I drove him to it with my constant questions about money. Dustin paled even more when he heard that recording. "She's exaggerating," he muttered. "We were just having a family spat, nothing serious." The tape went on. "I'm thinking of starting to record our conversations, not to show anyone, but to see what's going on. Sometimes, after his angry outbursts, I start to doubt my own memory." This next entry was obviously made later. Yesterday, he told me that if I told anyone about our problems, I would regret it for the rest of my life. When I asked what he meant, he just looked at me with that look in his eyes. I realized it was best not to insist on an explanation. The detective watched Dustin's reaction carefully. The man shifted his hands nervously, avoided eye contact, and opened his mouth several times, as if he were about to say something, but changed his mind. "Mr. Reeves, these notes were obviously made shortly before your wife disappeared. Would you care to comment on their contents?" Jeanette was, an emotional woman." Dustin struggled to find the words. "She often dramatized ordinary family situations, probably recorded these stories for her radio programs." But his explanation sounded lame, especially in light of the next recording. "I found correspondence with some woman on his phone. When I asked him about it, he exploded, yelled that I had no right to go through his stuff, and threw the phone at the wall. Then he said it was just a coworker, but I'd seen the texts. They're clearly dating." Dustin clenched his fists at the mention of texting. "That's not true," he said sharply. "I've never had anyone." "Then why did your wife write it down in such detail?" the detective asked. Another entry shed light on Jeanette's last days. "Tomorrow I plan to have a serious talk with him. I can't keep pretending nothing's going on. If he doesn't agree to couples therapy, I'll file for divorce. I have money in my own account, and my sister has offered to stay with her until things settle down." The detective paused in her listening and looked at Dustin. "Mr. Reeves, your wife was planning a divorce. That's a pretty serious motive for marital conflict." "She threatened divorce many times," Dustin replied, but his voice shook. It didn't mean anything. The last entry on the disc was particularly disturbing. "He told me this morning that he wouldn't let anyone destroy our family." When I replied that the family had already been destroyed by his behavior, he grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me so hard that I banged my head against the wall. Then he apologized and said he was just worried. But there was a warning in his voice. The detective turned off the record player and turned to Dustin. "Mr. Reeves, these tapes were made in the days leading up to your wife's disappearance. It's clear from them that there were serious conflicts between the two of you, and she feared for her safety." Dustin remained silent, staring at the floor. His hands were shaking and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the coolness of the basement. "Where is your wife, Mr. Reeves?" asked the detective bluntly. "I told you, she went to her mother's in Atlanta," he repeated, but his voice sounded unconvincing, even to himself. "We checked. Jeanette Reeves doesn't have a mother in Atlanta. Her mother died 5 years ago, and it's in the official records." Dustin looked up, and for the first time in the entire conversation, looked directly at the detective. His gaze read fear and the realization that lying didn't work anymore. "Yeah, we needed time to think. Jeanette was upset, and I thought a pause in the relationship would be good for us. Mr. Reeves, I must warn you that you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Dustin nodded but continued to remain silent. The detective realized he was on the verge of confessing, but was holding on for now. More hard evidence was needed. The officers continued to search the upper floors of the house. In the bedroom, they found evidence of a recent thorough cleaning, and in the bathroom, they found remnants of the chlorine products often used to remove traces of blood. The most important discovery was in the garage. Under the workbench was a woman's purse with documents in the name of Jeanette Reeves. The purse contained car keys, a wallet with money and credit cards, and a cell phone. "Mr. Reeves," the detective said as she demonstrated the purse, "if your wife left on a long trip, why did she leave her ID, money, and phone behind?" Dustin looked at the purse, and his eyes reflected despair and hopelessness. He realized that the game was over, that every piece of evidence found made his situation more and more hopeless. Detective Patton decided to increase the pressure on Dustin Reeves. The accumulated evidence created a clear enough picture, but more concrete evidence of the crime or a confession from the suspect himself was needed to formally charge him. "Mr. Reeves, let's talk frankly," she said, taking a seat in the chair across from the man in the living room. "We found tapes in which your wife documented your threats and physical abuse. We found her personal belongings that she would never have left behind when she voluntarily left. We have testimony from co-workers about oddities in your behavior after your wife disappeared." Dustin sat with his head down and remained silent. His hands rested in his lap, fingers nervously clenching and unclenching. The gray hairs on his temples became more visible in the bright light of the desk lamp. 3 months of constant tension and fear of exposure had turned the once confident man into a pathetic shadow. "Most importantly," the detective continued, "we know you lied about everything. About the trip to your mother's house, about the lack of home equipment, about why Jeanette disappeared. Lies tend to fall apart when confronted with facts." The house was silent, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock in the hallway. The uniformed officers continued their search of the other rooms, periodically reporting back to the detective the clues they had found. Each new find made Dustin's situation more and more hopeless. "Detective," one of the officers called out from the kitchen, "there's something interesting here." Patton left Dustin under the supervision of the second officer and walked into the kitchen. On the table was a calendar, open to the September page. The 27th of September was circled in red, and next to it was written in a woman's handwriting, "Serious talk with D." This entry looked like Janet's last hope of saving her marriage, or at least ending it in a civilized manner. "Is this Mrs. Reeves's handwriting?" the detective asked, showing the calendar to Dustin. He nodded without looking up. The simple movement of his head showed the weight of his confession. "So on September 27th, your wife was planning to have a serious talk with you. Tell me what that conversation was about." Dustin was silent for a long time, fighting his inner resistance. Then something in him broke, and he said quietly, "She wanted a divorce, said she was tired of our life and couldn't pretend to be happy anymore. Jeanette gathered all the facts about my cheating, my outbursts of anger, the way I controlled her. And how did you react to that?" "Yeah, I got angry. We'd been together for so many years, and she was ready to throw everything away over a few fights. I didn't understand why she couldn't just forget and move on like she used to." The detective sat down across from Dustin, sensing that he was finally ready to tell the truth. Tension hung in the air like before a thunderstorm. What happened next? We yelled at each other for over an hour. Jeanette said she had already consulted with an attorney and was ready to file divorce papers on Monday. I tried to convince her that we could fix things, go to a marriage counselor, start over. Dustin's voice grew quieter and quieter, as if he were reliving those awful moments all over again. Then she said she knew about Cynthia from work, about our seeing each other, and that this was the last straw. Janet showed me the printouts of our correspondence that she'd somehow gotten. "Cynthia is your colleague at the radio station?" Dustin nodded without raising his head. "We've been seeing each other for a few months. Nothing serious, just Jeanette had gotten so cold the last year, working all the time, recording her programs. Cynthia understood me, listened to my problems. Keep talking about that night. Jeanette said she was going to her lawyer in the morning to file for divorce, and that she would take half of all the property, including this house. I'd worked 20 years to buy it, renovated it with my own hands, and she wanted to sell it and split the money in half." Dustin's voice was tinged with the rage that had gripped him that fateful evening. The detective could see how, even now, 3 months later, the memory of the injustice of the property division made him angry. I grabbed her arm, trying to get her to sit down and talk calmly, but she lashed out and started climbing the stairs, screaming that the conversation was over forever. And then I ran after her. The detective listened intently, writing down every word of the confession, realized that this testimony would be key to the prosecution. At the top of the stairs, I grabbed her shoulder and turned her around. I wanted to look her in the eye and tell her I loved her, that we could make things right, but she pushed me away and lost her balance. Dustin fell silent, breathing heavily. Sweat broke out on his forehead, despite the coolness of the house. Jeanette fell backward and hit the back of her head on the wooden railing. The impact was very hard. I heard the sound. She collapsed immediately and never regained consciousness. Mr. Reeves, did your wife die instantly from the head injury? I'm not sure. I tried to revive her, I gave her CPR, heart massage, called her name. But after half an hour, I realized she was dead. There was no pulse, no breathing. The detective recorded every detail, realizing the importance of this testimony for a future trial. What did you do after you realized your wife was dead? At first, I just sat there and cried. Then panic set in. I realized that if I called the police and the ambulance, no one would believe me. I mean, we were yelling at each other, the neighbors could hear, and given my previous threats and what Janet had recorded. So, you decided to cover up the death? I couldn't think straight. I took her body downstairs to the garage, wrapped it in an old blanket, and put it in the trunk of my car. I drove around the city all night, wondering what to do next. When did you decide to bury the body? By morning. I remembered the woods outside of town, where we used to picnic in the early years of our marriage. There's a grove of oaks, a quiet place where few people go. Dustin described the burial site in detail, drawing the detective a diagram of the driveway. His testimony was so detailed that it left no doubt as to its accuracy. After the burial, I went home and started making up a story about going to visit my sick mother. I removed all the photos of Jeanette, hid her personal belongings in the garage, erased her contacts from my phone. How long did you plan to keep up this lie? I don't know. I was hoping that eventually people would forget, stop asking. Maybe in a year or two I'd say she died of an illness in Atlanta. The next day, Detective Patton organized a search operation at the specified location. The oak grove was found without difficulty, and a shallow grave was indeed discovered under a large tree with a split trunk. The body of Jeanette Reeves was exhumed and taken to the morgue for forensic examination. A preliminary report confirmed head trauma as the cause of death and set the approximate time as 3 months ago. A week later, Dustin Reeves was formally charged with involuntary manslaughter and concealing a crime. The court set his bail at $200,000, which he was unable to post, so he remained in custody until the trial. Leon Brooks, upon learning of the tragic outcome, tendered his resignation from the radio station. He could no longer work in a place that reminded him of his dead colleague and her killer. Cynthia, Dustin's mistress, also left town, unable to withstand the pressure of public opinion. Rachel Crawford received a commendation from the police station management for being civil and helping to solve the crime. Local media wrote about the case, calling Tiffany the little heroine who helped find the killer. The Reeves house emptied out and was soon put up for sale by the bank to pay off Dustin's debts for attorney fees. It took the neighbors a long time to get used to the idea that a murderer had lived among them for 3 months, saying hello to them every day and pretending to be a grieving husband. Tiffany couldn't play with her yellow walkie-talkie for a long time yet. Every time she turned it on, she remembered Jeanette's sad voice and those terrible recordings that led to the solving of the crime. Rachel did not insist that her daughter continue to use the toy, realizing the heavy associations it evoked. 6 months later, the trial took place. Dustin Reeves was found guilty of second-degree involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He appealed, but the High Court upheld the sentence. In his jail cell, Dustin thought back to that fateful night every night and considered how differently events might have unfolded if he had simply let go of Jeanette and let her go. Now he had lost not only his wife, but his own freedom, his home, his job, and the respect of others. Jeanette Reeves was buried in the city cemetery. Colleagues from the radio station, a few neighbors and distant relatives came to the funeral. On a simple granite headstone was engraved with the inscription, "Jeanette Reeves, loving wife, talented journalist, voice of hope for many families." Detective Patton, who attended the ceremony, thought justice had been served, but the price of that justice was too high. A woman died in her own home at the hands of the man who had sworn to protect her, and a little girl will remember for the rest of her life how a child's toy witnessed the tragedy.